Here's just a slide about who I am, a lot of bio background. There's more online. I'll have the slides available afterwards. Actually, this is part of a larger slide deck. And I want to just give a little preface about graph data science. So here, I showed this example in other talks before, but just two slides briefly. Let's think about having a medieval village somewhere in the Black Forest back in the Middle Ages. And here we've got 7 villagers. They all have cottage industries. Pat runs the pub, Hannah works the fields, Brenda runs the brewery, on and on. But just in this scope here of like 7 cottage industries, 7 individuals, we can represent a circular economy. And we can show that like Chris buys eggs from Thomas and flour from Iden and makes bread to sell to Pat at the pub. Now, using that kind of graph representation, you might come in and do some questions, some data science work. Like, for instance, which business is most influential? And frankly, when I've shown this example to business people, a lot of them immediately point to Hannah and say, oh, she's going to make a killing. And actually, if you run, there's a graph algorithm called tweeness centrality. It shows that Hannah has the highest rank. What that means is she's in the midst of deal flow. She's really central when it comes to business in this village. So this is an idea of using graphs to be able to get insights, inference, using graph data science. There's a much larger article about this. It's called Graph Thinking. So the general category here, what I'm talking about is graph data science, making inference with graphs. There's a lot of different useful technologies, a lot that's open source. Unfortunately, they're kind of divided in a lot of different camps. So you've got the people doing axiomatic W3C sorts of things that are provable. You've got people doing statistical relational learning, which are probabilistic or causality kinds of graphs. You've got people doing visualizations, people doing deep learning, on and on and on. Unfortunately, they don't really go to the same conferences. They don't talk to each other much. Their software really doesn't talk to each other. And our team identified about 3 years ago that this was a real big problem. We were working on graphs for natural language, and it was just so hard to integrate the different open source libraries. So we started working on a PyData-ish abstraction layer in Python to be able to integrate a lot of these and have a common abstraction. It's called KGLab. We'll show it a little bit later. I want to give some primary sources always, and there's some great background here if you want to look at where knowledge graphs have come from and just kind of the general category. Some of this stretches back into like the 18th century with Charles Sanders Peirce. In terms of the math, there's definitely a lot of graph theory and related math. And there's some other areas too, like category theory that comes pretty close to it, and topology also, I should say. Typically when they talk about a graph, you'll see this equation where a graph is basically 2 sets put together. It's a set of vertices and a set of the edges that connect them. And there's an especially popular area of this math that Barbassi and Albert came up with long ago, or 20 years ago. It's called random scale-free networks. And there's been a lot of math proven about it. Really interesting. Unfortunately, it doesn't really take into account the kind of graph data that we encounter in industry in use cases, because this math doesn't take into account properties like you'd see in a labeled property graph, or probabilities like you'd see in some sort of statistical relational learning, or motifs like you'd see in terms of motif prediction and using deep learning to analyze for patterns that repeat within a graph. So I just want to give the caveat that if you're reading the math is kind of out of sync with the practice. And I've talked to a lot of good mathematicians about this too. There's definitely some opportunities, but just keep in mind, there's the practice of what you do in graph data science. There are the open source projects. There are the vendors. There's the math, and they're all kind of disconnected. You're going to see a whole lot of stuff about W3C and RDF, and also about labeled property graphs. It's more like the commercial vendors. There are some ways to try to unify these that may or may not be working and have been in progress for a long time. There's also probabilistic graphs that none of the above really handle. So industry use cases that we run into typically combine these 3 parts: semantic, data graphs, and probabilistic. And not a lot of commercial support for that, but there is some good open source. Just real quick, here's a list of like different graph database vendors, also different consulting shops, small shops that have experts in particular areas. We welcome more to help curate this list if you have anything to add. Takeaway is there's more than 50 graph database vendors. And there's some very large scale projects out of China working with like hundreds of trillions of edges. So a lot of interesting stuff going on there. Now, this talk is mostly about data prep for graphs. And here's the problem. When you're doing data preparation work in data science, we talk about this Pareto rule where it's like 80-20 rule, right? 80% of your time in data science workflows is typically cleaning up the data, your data preparation, and 20% for everything else. And that's definitely the case when you're working in graphs, graph data science, and in fact, maybe even more so. The problem, though, is that the work that you have to do in data preparation for graphs typically must be done upstream of being able to load it into some sort of graph database. So I'll say that again. The hard part of cleaning up the data, graph data, so that you can use it in Knowledge Graph, actually that needs to be done, a lot of it, before you even load it into any sort of a database. And that really runs contra to a lot of vendors who have sort of one-size-fits-all claims where they do everything. The reality is there's a lot of graph preparation, and it may be very expensive kinds of work, especially where you have graphs that are measured in millions and billions and trillions. So I want to give a sampler for some of these kinds of graph data preparation and what you should be aware of when you're doing this kind of work, and also just some tools and techniques that are really useful. So first one is deduplication. If you have a graph that has millions or billions of elements, and some of those are really important, but they occur many times because they haven't been deduplicated, then there's not going to be a lot of connectivity or predictive power out of the graph. So you need to be able to find the things that are similar, and if they indeed are the same entity, merge them together. If they're not quite the same entity, disambiguate them. And these tend to be very high dimensional kinds of problems. There's some great tools. Datasketch is excellent for probabilistic data structures, approximation algorithms, as I say. There's name match, where you can train models for disambiguating names. And of course, there's all the nearest neighbor work, different types of algorithms inside of scikit-learn and related. And frankly, this is a really good area too for a lot of deep learning, such as graph neural networks. And I anticipate seeing a lot more here. This is a hard problem because if you're deduplicating hundreds of millions of entities and it's something that requires similarity analysis and other kinds of lookups, you can get into a really complex, expensive problem pretty quickly. There's also the matter of unique identifiers. If you have unique items within a graph, they need to have some sort of identifier to be able to refer to them uniquely. And of course, UIDs work in a lot of cases if it's just strings, but there's a lot of times when you're working with graph data, when you have to transform, say, into a very large sparse matrix, do some calculation, and then transform the results back out into your graph. And so there, you really can't use UUIDs. You need to have numeric representation. And so you do run into this problem in industry at scale of having to assign unique identifiers. There's some great tools. Keyvi works with finite state transducers. So you can do in-memory immutable FSTs for really fast lookups. That's kind of what the diagram is showing here. And also Redis is like the Swiss Army knife in this area too. I use Redis so much for this. Another area that may be kind of counterintuitive is something called cycle detection. And this is actually the problem that plagues a lot of people when they get into doing graph data science work. In a graph, a lot of times with knowledge graphs, we're working with what's called a directed graph. So A points to B points to D. There's arrows. Sometimes, some types of algorithms, you'll use undirected graphs. One of the problems may be that the arcs are wrong or the direction is wrong in your data. So for instance, if you were representing a family tree, the fact is distance cousins do marry. So family trees are typically graphs, not trees. But you would think that these are acyclic graphs. Okay, some individual children are not in turn also their grandparents. And the same thing happens when you're looking at shipping containers and manifest data in industry. You really don't want to see the same shipping container going back and forth between two warehouses, but it happens a whole lot, and it's a cost sink. It's a problem. And certainly in accounting and e-commerce and finance, there's a lot of fraud that goes on because of cycles that really should not be there. So detecting the cycles in your graph at scale, it's a difficult problem. You can use breadth first search in other ways. but you need to be able to resolve it before you can really go in and do the inference that you need to do. And then next is something called transitive closure. This is where, if you've ever worked in object-oriented languages that have class inheritance, like Python or Scala, Java, etc., um, there's this idea of being able to inherit from parent classes. And so in the graph space, this is referred to as transitive closure. It's the kind of operation that you do to propagate the inherited properties through a graph. And typically, you need to do that before you can really run certain types of queries or certain types of analysis for them to be correct. If you've ever tried to perform transitive closure inside of a relational database at scale, anything non-trivial in terms of size, you'll find that the thing comes crashing down, or maybe takes hours and hours before a query returns. This is something called the self-join problem, because to be able to do this, you need to hop through links in a graph. And typically in a relational database, that means you're doing a self-join. You're joining a table to itself over and over and over again. And that usually brings the indexes crashing down. There's some really useful tools like LRL that we've been using to manage transitive closure, but it's something you have to be aware of. Another thing is that a lot of times when you're bringing in data, you may not know in advance what's actually linked. You may get raw data. So a classic example is somebody gives you a whole bunch of network security logs. And in fact, I mean, in the network security space, that's kind of like a capture the flag competition. They just give you a big log data set, like a Kaggle data set. And then you have to figure out how the things that need to be linked should be linked. So this happens a lot with graphs, is you have to build them up probably from some raw unstructured data. And there are some techniques for this. One of the most popular is called UMAP. It's a kind of visualization technique. It's for manifold analysis for dimensional reduction. It's similar to t-SNE, if you've ever seen that. But it also shows how data should probably be linked. Over on the right-hand side, there's a diagram of doing some genomic analysis, different types of genes being expressed that are related to each other, showing how they could be linked in a graph. There's a really excellent tutorial about this on this UMAP library that I linked. It's called How UMAP Works. Now, opposite of this, another thing that's sort of the converse problem. If you're working with data coming out of data warehouses, data lakes, like houses, all that, the thing that you run into in enterprise over and over again is that somebody had linked data, graph data, and they were tasked with representing it, loading it into a relational data warehouse. And they couldn't really figure out how to do that. What they will typically do is denormalize a lot of the context. So a row will actually have a lot of data included for some of its parent links. And you're the poker tell on this is you'll see really wide rows with a lot of repeated context. And this happens very frequently, and it makes data warehouses explode. So when you run into this, the way to build a graph out of it is you have to go through and cache the context and then keep doing lookups to it. Things like Keyvi might come in really handy here. There's a lot of potential uses for deep learning for doing something called link prediction. So basically learn the kind of motifs, the kind of patterns that you would expect to see in a graph. And then when you see a data object that's missing some of those, suggest, hey, maybe something is missing in the data, or maybe something should be expected here. And this is related to like AKBC, automatic construction of knowledge bases, graph bases. It's actually a pretty good conference called AKBC. Another thing about graphs is just keep in mind that if you're using ontologies, controlled vocabularies, if you've got that as your schema for your graph, like you do in terms of W3C kind of graphs, that's great. It's really useful. Labeled property graphs kind of avoid this, but then sooner or later, they probably find out that, we might need or want to do that. How do we take our labeled property graph data and then put it under an ontology? Well, there's ways to do that. It's sometimes painful. But the long and short is that ontology is a tool, and it's not always done correctly the first time. It may require some iteration. If there's a popular ontology that you're using, frankly, a use case might use several ontologies. You'll need to align them. You'll need to make sure that they fit your use cases. You might need to extend them. And even after you've done all that, class inheritance doesn't solve everything. Typically, we find that there are multiple ontologies used, but then you also weave some sort of taxonomy through it. For most of the kinds of AI applications with graphs that we see, that's a common thing. So If you've got people who are really dogmatic about ontology, they're probably going to be a problem. Take it with a grain of salt. Understand there are limits to ontology. Understand that there are ways to do post-processing and pre-processing. And even after you've done your graph queries, you may need to apply some GraphML or some post-processing or some sort of probabilistic rules, et cetera, just to make sense out of what's going on there. Don't rely only on queries and ontology. Another big area is that, well, for any large graph project, you probably are going to be pulling some data out of a data warehouse, out of some spreadsheets. There's probably thousands of spreadsheets in the enterprise that are relevant. And so how do you migrate that data? How do you do the data translations to go from, say, relational databases, spreadsheets, et cetera, and move them into a graph data model to fit your schema, your ontology? So there's a standard called R2ML that maps from relational to RDF. And then more broadly than that, there's something called RML, which will do translations of relational plus other kinds of sources. I really like this project, Morph KGC. We've been working with this team. Shout out to Oscar Concho at UPM in Madrid. And grad students also working on this. Too many to name right now, but I appreciate you all. Morph KGC is a really excellent way to pull in sources from, say, MySQL or Postgres or wherever. Another thing in data science, of course, we talk a lot about data labeling. It's a really hot area because of preparing data sets for AI projects in general. And there's a lot of commercial ventures along these lines for data labeling and whatnot. Also, some really great open source projects. I work with one that's called Argila, which is a way of doing data labeling pipelines that kind of put some DevOps-ish types of things around Hugging Face. So tens of thousands of models in Hugging Face. You can wire them up to Flare or Spacey, whatever you're using in Python for NLP, leverage the models, but also capture where decisions being made, and also bring in some human in the loop kind of aspects. So, you might use weak supervision or active learning so that you can bring in your domain experts to clean up the labels. And the labels in a graph are a little bit more complicated. One is there's something called entity extraction in NLP. And this is where we're taking a look at the labels that'll be applied to nodes. And we're trying to figure out what classes do those need to be? What do they inherit? And so there's some sort of unique identifier, a URL, if you will, but they're called IRIs. It's like URL plus plus. And so we need to be able to link into our controlled vocabulary for every node to be identified, what class it is. And then for the edges, for the predicates that are represented on edges, there's a different type of NLP approach called relation extraction, where we're trying to figure out what links, how do we classify these links? So there's a couple of really great tools here. Argila is nice for incorporating, sort of your MLOps, if you will, along with a lot of popular libraries in Python. And then there's a really great listing of awesome relation extraction. And just in general, you're going to be blending large language models with supervision, active learning for, human in the loop practices, and then also sort of the ops-ish MLOps type practices, like keeping track of what decisions are made where and how to go back and revise them. Another area has to do with visualization in graphs. You may have seen some really beautiful graph visualizations. And I'll tell you, when you put those in front of executives, you definitely hear a lot of oohs and ahs. Sometimes they're a little bit too beautiful. One of the typical problems is to go out and do a really gorgeous data visualization of your graph, put it in front of executives, and they go, wow, that's great. We should frame it and put it on the wall. What does it mean? What does that little purple dot over there mean? And the thing is that it may be that the things that look really good in a graph rendering have little or nothing to do with the important details of your use case. And automated layouts really accentuate this. So there's some ways around it. There are uses of graph theory. If you have the math background, you can use chordal graphs or various forms of topological transforms to highlight the things that are important and avoid highlighting the trivial things. You can also use GNNs to find patterns, motif prediction. Definitely recommend Masej Besta and others working in this area. There's some great tools. There's .motif, there's PyGraphistry. We work with the Graphistry folks. They're really awesome. And motif minding is going to be a big thing here. I'm going to scoot along real quick because I'm running out of time, but a lot of room ahead on this. And then last but not least, even if you've done all of the above really well, there's still the looming issue always in data science of data quality. So whenever you're working in data analytics in general, data quality is a concern, and it should be a concern. And graphs, this is a bit more poignant. There's a couple of great tools. One is called Shackle, and this is a kind of shape constraint. So you could think of applying unit tests of patterns and expected values, expected ranges on data values, things like that, that you want to apply throughout your graph. And then basically, like a unit test, kick out the parts that don't pass the tests. Alternatively, there's something called PSL that I like to use. It's probabilistic soft logic. And the idea is you can run some probabilistic rules through your graph and then assign uncertainty values for which parts of your graph are more believable than others. Also, you can sort of run that on the whole graph and figure out how consistent is this whole graph. So think about this in terms of data quality and data integration. Think about you bring up a graph and you measure it probabilistically, see how consistent is this graph based on the rules that I have for its domain. And then you load another data update and measure it again. And if the consistency drops, well, there's probably a problem. And then go back and apply the PSL rules and the shackle rules and say, let's put a spotlight on the elements that we've just loaded that are causing problems. Let's get some experts to look at those. Maybe there's data quality problems. So Ryan Wisniewski has really brilliant work applying category theory in this area. They've used it at Uber and others, and definitely look at that for the long term. And we've got some tutorials that cover a lot of this. Basically, there's some Jupyter notebooks up online that we have where we show using these kinds of techniques with a sample from food.com of 250,000 recipes. And just some things to think about when you're doing data preparation and building up workflows so that you can get to the point of actually doing something interesting, like maybe a recommender system. In the time remaining, I want to add real quickly, we've got a proposed standard. We found in our work, especially with customers, that as it turns out, Parquet is really effective for managing graph data. And in particular, we've put together a way of using Parquet to get us a couple of orders of magnitude increase. And it also really aligns with the ETL tools like Spark and Trino and Cassandra, et cetera. But we have a way of being able to represent semantic graphs, label property graphs, probabilistic graphs, imports from spreadsheets, imports from data frames, exports to edge lists, etc., all in a common kind of Parquet format. So here's some tools for being able to explore that and use that with your data. And then lastly, I moderate a group on LinkedIn called Graph Data Science. There's a lot of people there, over 600, and we have links to other conferences and communities as well. If you want to grab the slides, they're here online. Here's the URL and also a 2D URL for it. And if you want to get a hold of me, I'm over in the Fediverse. I'm Pacoid at mastodon.green. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much for this informative talk. And we are waiting for any questions.
I should say the slides, there's about 150 slides in that deck that I linked to. So let me put that back up. I'll just leave that in the channel. So yeah, there's a lot of slides, a lot more material. This is a short talk compared to the rest of it. But we really go into a lot more of the business case. And there's a lot of use cases that are illustrated in industry where they're using graphs for AI applications, especially some interesting stuff out of pharma and like drug discovery, genomics, etc.
Great. Thank you for sharing.
Certainly. And I'll just put a plug in again too. We've got a lot of people using KG Lab and doing integrations. We're very actively working with a couple of dozen at last count of other open source projects for providing integration paths. We're looking toward adding more or working with other people. So let us know. We've got a pretty lively developer community working on this. And the intent is really to make these graph technologies talk with each other, but also look very PyData-ish, like run a graph query, get a pandas data frame as a result back. So if you're interested in working with us, please let us know. We're all over GitHub and whatnot.
Um, Great. Thank you very much for this amazing talk. There are no questions. So if you would like to wrap up here.
Okay, great. Yeah, okay, thank you very much. I really appreciate, and have a great rest of the conference. I look forward to checking out a lot of the talks. Oh,
Oh,
wait, hi, Mark
questions.
Antoine.
Yeah.
Yeah. Oh, hey, uh, really great question. So, who's working on category theory of graphs? That's Ryan Wisniewski, wisniewski.net, I believe is right. Let me make sure. I can't quite check that out. It's in my slides, but Ryan Wisniewski, they have a company that he's co-founder of called Connexus AI, and they've been working especially on using category theory to do like schema alignment. If you're bringing in graph data from multiple sources, how do you make sure that the different ontologies align, and how can you try to align them more optimally? And also just data quality measurements. There's some really interesting things. Basically, categories are richer than graphs. So category theory is sort of over and beyond what you'd see in graph theory. So you can use it to really constrain. That's kind of the long and short. There's some great talks. I think I was just listening to something from Josh Genevier, who's one of his research partners, was interviewing Ryan. Just listening to that yesterday. So definitely look for their videos online. And ping me too. Ping me on Mastodon, and I'll get some more links for you.
Awesome. Thank you.
Okay. Have a great rest of the conference.